Welcome back, everyone. Tonight's story is called Skinwalker, and it's written by Max Minton. My father told me a story once, and I'll never forget it for a few reasons. I think it's the first story he ever told me as a child. It's also the story of how my grandfather died. But honestly, that isn't the reason. You hear stories on TV, or sometimes you overhear something in a public place. People talk about ghosts or aliens, and you think to yourself, that isn't real, they're making it up, or they're mistaken, or they're crazy, or something like that. You just can't believe it. Until something happens. Something that brings it all together. Connects the dots in a way you didn't even think of before. Maybe it happens to you. Maybe you hear the same story again and again, happening to different people. It doesn't take long for the world to become a lot bigger than you thought it was. As I said, this is a story my father told me, but I never believed it, even though he swore up and down it was true. It wasn't until I started clicking around the internet that I started to believe. I started to hear other stories just like the one my father told me, and it didn't take me long to believe in the Rake. That's not what my father called it, of course. He's never used the internet in his life. He wouldn't know what the consensus has taken to naming it. When he chose to call it something other than it or that thing, he called it Skinwalker, after an old Navajo tale that his grandfather had told him. But I'll tell you the story, the way that he told me. We were out hunting one night, he'd tell me. Coyotes. We'd kill them for $50 a skin. They lived on a dairy farm in Ohio. They'd kill calves sometimes, and we'd do it every night because we needed the money. Sometimes, while we were out, we'd come on a deer and kill it. Our landlord didn't mind, and it could feed our family for a few nights and save us some money. Anyway, we were done making our rounds and heading home, walking, because we didn't have a car or some four-wheeler back then. We cut through the woods, and that's when we came upon it. Blood everywhere, splattered on the trees, in the grass, in the creek, everywhere. We'd seen it sometimes when they couldn't scavenge and started hunting deer or cattle. The worst was when they bred with feral dogs. But this wasn't like that. You see, when a pack of dogs or wolves or coyotes attack something, they do it right. They'll pick off the last one, the one that's weak or sick or old or just small. They'll hunt it, draw it into a corner, someplace that it can't get out of, and they'll run it right to the biggest one, the alpha. And that deer will never see that alpha. It might hear it, but it won't see it. It'll just notice that its throat is gone, and then it'll drop dead. It's quick and it's clean. That wasn't what happened here. Something had run up on a den of deer. Coyotes won't attack a den, wolves neither, because they'd get too much of a fight. There were three bodies, just torn apart. You'd see a head here, a leg there, a torso there. Now, predators, they don't do that. They don't leave behind scraps. What had done this hadn't done it for food. It had done it for fun. But we didn't know that. We saw a bunch of carcasses and we think it's something that we've got to take care of. I remember my dad telling me to go home. He thought it was a pack of feral dogs. But I wasn't leaving him, and I sure wasn't walking through 2 miles of woods alone, with nothing but a .22 and a pocket knife. Now I'll explain here. My dad was only 13 at the time, so a .22 was about the only rifle that he could reliably use. Anyway, he said, Dad had a shotgun, and so I wasn't going anywhere without it. It took me a while to convince him, but finally we began tracking whatever did that. It wasn't hard either. We just followed the blood. Either that thing bled a deer before it got away, or it dragged one for a mile. I don't know. I know that I'd never seen my dad scared before that night. We started hearing noises. I've been in a lot of woods in my life. I've been all over the world, and I ain't never heard noises like I heard that night. I heard things screaming. Heard deer and fox and rabbits, raccoons and birds, just scared. Keep in mind, this was maybe 12 or 1 o'clock. Except some fox and some birds, nothing was supposed to even be awake. But they weren't just awake, they were moving. I saw flocks of birds that night fly straight into the trees, just trying to get out of there. We came up on a pack of coyotes, nearly shot a couple thinking it was what we were looking for. But then we saw that they were running towards us, and then they ran right past us and didn't even notice us. Then some deer did the same thing, then some rabbits, squirrels, foxes, even a couple of wild hogs. These things were supposed to be eating each other, and the only thing they cared about right then, though, was getting away. We should have put it together that maybe whatever we were tracking wasn't something we were supposed to see, and maybe it wasn't something we could kill. I don't know why we just didn't go home. I guess we were curious. And I think that was my dad's nature, to go towards the trouble, towards a fight. And knowing what I knew about my father and what he did during the war, my nature was to stay close to him. Finally, we got into an open valley. It was a normal soy field, but it wasn't in season, so it was just flat dirt. We saw the tracks then. A lot of the animals fleeing the forest had paved over the land. But where the deer blood was, nothing had taken a single step, like they were leaving it for us to find. The tracks were shallow. Whatever it was couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds. But that didn't mean much. A bobcat weighed only 40 pounds, and it nearly tore out my throat once. All that means is that it's quick and it's hard to hit. So we follow the tracks, and it doesn't take us long to find out where it is. There's this old schoolhouse that sits on the top of a hill. Half of it had been ripped out by a tornado, but nobody lived there, not for a long time. We caught homeless people in there sometimes, or druggies looking for a safe place to shoot up. We figured maybe that was it. Maybe it was some sick kid riding a high. But we didn't think that for very long. We get within 50 yards and we hear this noise, a screeching kind of sound. It was sort of made up of two different sounds. One was high-pitched, like a screech, and the other was a low-pitched growl. It was making both at the same time. We get within 20 yards and we hear this sound. I can remember thinking that it sounded like paper being torn apart, while someone was swinging water in a bucket back and forth. Dad looks at me, kneels down and whispers, "I gotta stay behind him because we're about to corner him. Any animal will fight when it's cornered, especially when it's a predator. But we can tell by the tracks that it's just one." He tells me it's probably a single feral dog, probably rabid. The plan is to sneak up on it while it's eating, shoot it, and then keep shooting it until it don't move anymore. Then slit its throat. If it gets to Dad, it's my job to shoot it or stab it and get it off of him. So he walks up, and I'm right behind him, just a tad to his side so I can see what it is. And I wish to this day that I hadn't. It's leaning over a carcass, tearing off flesh, and throwing what it doesn't nibble to the side. There's blood all over the brick, glistening in the moonlight. It's pale, white, human-looking, but not quite human. It had arms and legs like a human, but it sat like a monkey, hunched over. And its hands weren't normal. It had long fingers with claws at the end. So we see that and my dad hesitates. He wasn't about to fire on a person, so he clears his throat to try to get it to turn around. I swear to God, all the noise just ceased. I haven't ever heard true silence like that before, and definitely not after. But for 2 seconds, nothing made a noise. Which made it all the louder when it turned around and made this shrill cry as it jumped on my dad. He got a shot off, but I think he missed. If he hit the thing, it didn't mind. But it was on him, tearing parts off of him. So I started shooting it with my .22, point blank. But it barely did anything. I got off 5 rounds, and then I started hitting it with the gun butt, but it wasn't budging. It didn't even register that I was there. It clawed at my dad, taking off bits of his flesh. It started on his torso, and then it moved up. It tore out his throat. It tore off his nose, his eyes. It scalped him. Then it started digging in and ripped off the bottom half of his jaw, all the little bones and that tube in your neck. And then it got towards his ribs and started ripping at those. I don't exactly remember what happened, but somehow my dad's knife ended up in the thing's shoulder, and my dad ended up on my back. I was running faster than I'd ever run before or after, and it's following me. I ended up back in the woods, opposite the ones we'd been in, and I'm heading towards my landlord's house, 'cause it's half a mile away. I can hear this thing screeching and moaning. I hear the tree branches crack and get thrown around. It sounds like someone's taking an axe to every single tree that I pass. It's cracking so loud and often, but I just don't look back. Finally, I trip onto gravel. I look up and there's my landlord and a bunch of his buddies drinking around a campfire. I scream and I cry, and they come over. I'm telling them to call an ambulance, and he looks at me, and I'll never forget what he said. "What's that on your back?" he asked me. Just as he said it, he saw one of those god-awful flannel shirts my dad wore everywhere. It was what was left of my dad. Most of his head, his torso, but nothing after the waist. Suddenly we hear it, screeching. He grabs me. My dad gets thrown to the ground. I'm fighting him, crying, 'cause I think we can still save him somehow. But my dad had been gone before I even picked him up. He has to pick me up and throw me inside before I come with him. He and his buddies were all outside, and they're locking doors, getting guns. The landlord's asking me, what happened, but I just don't know what to tell him. He pieced enough of it together to understand that there was something dangerous there. All of the lights in the house are on, and someone calls the cops. They'll be there, but in 15 minutes. We look outside and we see it walk in front of the fire that they'd made. Don't know what it is, one of them says. It looks like an ape. Suddenly, something goes through the window. We shoot at it, but it ain't the thing. It's my landlord's dog. Just the body, though. Not its head or its legs. We start pushing things in front of doors and windows. And when we hear something in the garage, I remember one of his friends saying the doors were open. We hear metal and glass getting ripped apart. We put a couch and a TV in front of the door to the garage. It banged around some more, but then it got quiet. Not silent like it was before. We could hear it move around some, and the guys were talking, making sure the guns were ready. Someone hands me a pistol. No sooner did I cock the hammer back than we hear something shatter upstairs, and then we heard it screech again, except it was louder, and it didn't echo and fade out, because it was inside. We all rushed to the one door leading upstairs. We got to it just as the thing did. It opened just a bit, and 4 or 5 men slammed into it. It got its hands through. Someone with a shotgun took care of that, put the barrel right up to the wrist and pulled the trigger. Cut its hand off, clean. Now that only annoyed it though. It started pushing on the door, clawing. We were on one side, pushing as best we could. It was on the other, doing the same. The wood just wasn't going to hold, so someone tells us to keep our heads down. Suddenly the top half of the door is just gone, and my ears are ringing. There are splinters everywhere. 2 or 3 of them just unloaded on the top of the door. I don't really know where it went after that. The police got there. I was still glued to that door, or what was left of it. The sun was up before they got me off it. They put me in the hospital for a while. A lot of people talked to me, but I didn't talk back. Not for a long, long time. When I finally got home, I got a job from the landlord working on the farm. We didn't talk much, not about the thing, but I signed up for the army when I was 19, and he sat me down to drink some scotch as a send-off. I asked him right away what the police had told him. The story they went with was a wild animal, probably a wolf, or maybe a bear that had migrated north. I asked him how they could say that when they had the hand, and he looks at me stunned. He tells me that the hand never made it back to the station. The cop who had it in his car wrecked, drove into a tree, and died on impact. The hand was never found, probably taken by an animal. The cops, when they would acknowledge that the hand existed at all, said it was simply the paw of a bear that looked like a human hand. I never talked to the landlord again. He went missing when I was in basic. The cops never found him. I never talked to the landlord again. He went missing when I was in basic. The cops never found him. They said he owed some people some money and just ran away, but I don't think it's that simple. I never went back to those woods again, and I wouldn't even if I had the entire US Army at my back. That's where my dad's story ended. But that last bit was a lie, because when my mother died, I think my father thought he didn't have anything left and he might as well settle old scores. And he went back into those woods, but he never came back. The FBI was called and they did a show for everyone involved, but I knew they weren't really looking. I had to get one drunk and slip him a few 50s before he finally told me that they get a few calls about those woods every year, about someone up and vanishing. But that was all he wanted to tell me. Before he got up and left with the rest of his team, he wrote, "The Rake," onto a napkin. I didn't know what it meant until I searched the internet. Honestly, I would rather not have known. Well, everyone, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, consider hitting the like button and consider hitting the subscribe button, because there's more to come. Anyway, thank you for watching.